For as long as Matteo could remember, he had lived in an orphanage alongside his younger sister, Lucia. He had no memory of their parents, though from time to time he would recall a large house filled with beautiful paintings and a grand white piano in the living room. This vision even appeared in his dreams, but whenever he mentioned it to the caregivers, they dismissed it as mere fantasy. "You couldn't have lived in such a luxurious home," they would say. "It's just your imagination. Orphans don't come to us from mansions. Rich children are pampered and never leave the house without a bodyguard." Though these words stung, Matteo couldn't shake the image of that bright, beautiful house from his mind. Matteo also had another trait that made him stand out from the other children. When he and Lucia were first brought to the orphanage, Matteo clung tightly to a black violin case. He held it so fiercely that the caregivers struggled to pry it from his grasp, as if he feared losing the last connection to his past. The violin inside was ordinary, as was the case, and despite their efforts, the orphanage staff found no note or clues that could lead them to the children's parents. Matteo and Lucia arrived at the orphanage in a disheveled state, covered in dirt and with scratches on their bodies. The workers surmised that the children had been through a lot before arriving. At first, the 6-year-old Matteo was so terrified that he barely left his room and refused to speak to anyone. He spent hours perched on the windowsill, as if waiting for someone to come and take him home. But when asked about his parents, he could offer no answers. "Did your parents hurt you?" a caregiver inquired, but Matteo only shook his head. "Then where did you get these bruises?" she pressed. Matteo merely shrugged, leaving the staff unsure whether he had truly forgotten or simply didn't want to talk about it. No matter how much they tried, they couldn't get any information out of him. Meanwhile, Lucia, who was just 4, slept most of the time and only allowed Matteo near her when she was awake. He would feed her with a spoon and tell her fairy tales, stories he must have heard from their parents. Months passed this way, and the caregivers eventually lost hope that Matteo and Lucia's parents would come for them. The children had become dear to the caregivers, especially Matteo, who would take out his violin every evening to play long, beautiful, melancholic melodies. The women were amazed at how a boy so young could play with such mastery. His music moved them to tears, though they tried to hide it. "Who taught you to play the violin?" his favorite caregiver, Maria, once asked him. "I don't remember," Matteo admitted truthfully. He couldn't recall anything from before the orphanage. The trauma of past events seemed to have blocked his memory, shielding him from the pain. But playing the violin seemed to bring him comfort and peace, giving him a sense of security in his difficult circumstances. As time passed, Matteo grew older and continued to hone his violin skills, playing every evening. He and Lucia gradually adapted to life in the orphanage and became closer to the caregivers. Of course, there were challenges along the way. Matteo sometimes clashed with the other children, who teased him for being a sweet boy and envied the attention he received from the adults. Some tried to intimidate him, but they never dared to physically harm him, knowing the caregivers would notice any new bruises. Matteo endured their threats and taunts, finding solace in his violin, his truest friend. However, one day, one of the boys managed to steal the violin from Matteo, and that's when Matteo finally lost his temper. No one had ever seen him so enraged. He threw pillows and chairs, stomped his feet, and yelled loudly. The other children scattered in fear. The noise brought the orphanage staff running, and they were shocked to find Matteo in such a state. Their attempts to calm him down failed. He wouldn't let anyone near him. Finally, Matteo screamed, "Give me back my violin." It was only then that the caregivers understood the cause of his outburst. Maria stayed with Matteo while the others found the boys, scolded them, and made them return the violin. Terrified, the boys quickly brought back the instrument, and from that day on, no one dared to bother Matteo again. His life settled into a more peaceful routine. However, Lucia often came to him for help. She lived separately in the girls' room and was also frequently teased. This upset her deeply, and she secretly dreamed of running away from the orphanage. But Matteo refused to entertain the idea. We wouldn't survive out there, he said reasonably. We're just kids. Wait until I turn 18. Then I can work and take you away from here. Lucia cried at the thought of waiting so long. But that's 8 whole years from now, she protested. I can't wait that long. Matteo gently stroked her hair. It's okay. You just need to be patient. Maybe some kind people will warm up to you, Matteo reassured her. Only me, Lucia asked, her voice trembling. What about you? Matteo simply shrugged. I'm still hoping that our real parents will come for us. Lucia began to cry, and Matteo would wrap his arms around her, whispering, I do too. Yet deep down, he knew it was impossible. He couldn't remember why, but he had a strong feeling that their parents would never return. As the years passed, life at the orphanage became increasingly difficult for Lucia. The other girls still refused to accept her, often mocking her curly hair, the freckles on her nose, and her awkward appearance. Lucia cried more frequently, struggled to fall asleep, and barely ate. She spent most of her time hidden away in some corner where no one could find her, either playing with her beloved stuffed rabbit or reading books. One early morning, while Lucia was still asleep in the dormitory, her roommates threw open the window, yanked off her blanket, and tied her to the bed with ropes made from an old sheet. Lucia woke up shivering from the cold, but was unable to move. She struggled desperately to free herself, but the girls had tied the knots so tightly that escape was impossible. As a result, Lucia caught a severe cold. Initially, the caregivers didn't pay much attention to her condition. They didn't call a doctor, instead isolating Lucia from the other children and giving her warm drinks and herbal remedies to soothe her cough. However, Lucia's condition worsened day by day. Maria was the first to notice the seriousness of the situation and promptly called a doctor. The diagnosis was pneumonia, already in a fairly advanced stage. The exposure to cold and the general weakness brought on by constant stress had taken a toll on her health. Lucia required serious medical treatment, which came with a cost. When Matteo learned of this, he was filled with fear and despair. He had no idea how to help his sister or where to find the money needed for her treatment. The thought of losing the only person he cared about terrified him. I have to find a way to earn the money for her treatment. But how? As usual in moments of distress, Matteo reached for his violin to calm his nerves. As he looked at the instrument, an idea suddenly struck him. He immediately ran to Maria and shared his plan. Maria listened carefully to the boy. Yes, I think we can make that work, she said thoughtfully. But are you sure you're up for it? There will be a lot of people watching. The boy nodded eagerly. I'll give it a try. It's better than doing nothing. Maria agreed, and she promised to speak with the orphanage director to make the arrangements. At first, the headmistress was hesitant about Matteo's idea, but Maria's gentle yet persuasive manner eventually won her over. Fine, the woman finally said. I'll allow it, but only if you take full responsibility for the boy. Maria gave her word. Early the next morning, she and Matteo stood at the orphanage entrance, ready to leave. Matteo was dressed in his best white shirt and black pants with suspenders, clutching his beloved violin case in his hands. Are you ready? Maria asked, adjusting her hat. The boy nodded resolutely. They left the building and headed to the train station, as the orphanage was located on the outskirts of town. The walk wasn't far, and they passed the time by exchanging riddles. Maria also shared stories about her own childhood, which she had spent in an orphanage as well. Matteo was surprised. He had never known that Maria was an orphan like him. I wish I'd been born earlier, the boy said. I would have adopted you. Maria laughed, though she was clearly touched by his words. I would have loved to be your daughter, Matteo, but unfortunately, that's not possible. The boy sighed. Sometimes, it seems like the best people have the hardest lives, he observed thoughtfully. Maria nodded in agreement. Finally, they reached the station, and Maria purchased their train tickets. Matteo gazed out the window, his nerves growing as they drew closer to the city. Just as in his early childhood, he clutched the violin case tightly, seeking comfort in its familiar weight. Eventually, they arrived at the main city station. They took their place in the central square, and Matteo carefully removed his violin from its case. He began to play while Maria circled the square with a hat, collecting coins and bills from the passers-by. Many people stopped to listen, captivated by the beautiful and emotional melodies that Matteo played. Gradually, the hat in Maria's hands filled with money. After about an hour and a half, the hat was full. Although Matteo had already taken a short break, he was still very tired and hungry. Maria signaled that it was time to stop, but Matteo decided to play one last piece. He chose his favorite, a gentle and soothing melody, and played it with deep emotion. As he closed his eyes, he didn't notice right away that a man had stopped nearby to listen. The man was around 45 years old, tall and handsome, with dark hair streaked with gray. He had a tan complexion, a mustache, and a goatee. His gray eyes were serious, even stern, as he watched the boy intently. Matteo noticed the man only after finishing the piece. The man seemed vaguely familiar, but Matteo couldn't place him. "Where did you learn that melody?" the man demanded suddenly. "Who taught you to play it?" Matteo was taken aback. Why was this man questioning him so harshly? Had he somehow stolen someone else's music? But he had known this melody since childhood, though he couldn't remember who had taught him. "I don't remember," the boy stammered, looking around helplessly for Maria. She was already hurrying over from the other side of the square. "Excuse me, but you have no right to speak to my charge in that manner," she said firmly, though she was slightly out of breath. "Charge?" the man echoed, glancing at Maria and the hat filled with money, clearly puzzled. "So this boy, I live in an orphanage," Matteo finished for him. The man's face paled, and he clutched his chest as if in pain. "But you look so much like—" The man trailed off, his strength seeming to leave him mid-sentence. "Like who?" Matteo asked eagerly. "Who do I resemble?" But the man didn't reply. Without another word, Maria swiftly guided Matteo towards the ticket counters. Matteo resisted, pleading, "But Maria, this man seems to know something about my parents. He said I resemble someone. We need to ask him." However, Maria remained firm. "No, Matteo, this man seems suspicious. You heard how he confronted you about that song. Maybe he's not right in the head and is just imagining things. We can't trust anyone. I'm responsible for you, remember?" Maria spotted an available ticket counter and quickly pulled Matteo along. After purchasing 2 return tickets, she hurried Matteo to the platform, relieved to see that the train was leaving in 5 minutes. Maria and Matteo boarded the train, and soon after, the doors closed. Matteo clutched his violin case tightly once more, while Maria held on to the bag containing the money they had collected. This should be enough for Matteo's sister's medicine, Maria thought with satisfaction. But Matteo had completely forgotten about the money. His mind was preoccupied with the mysterious man they had encountered in the station square. Now, Matteo was certain he had seen the man before, but it was too late to pursue the matter. Fortunately, to everyone's relief, Lucia made a speedy recovery. Within a week, she was back at the orphanage. The caregivers, realizing how cruelly the girls in her previous room had treated her, decided to move Lucia to a room on a different floor. There, Lucia quickly made a new friend, a modest yet cheerful girl named Sophia. Matteo was overjoyed when his sister told him the good news, but he couldn't shake the thoughts of the dark-haired man from the train station. His life no longer felt the same. He blamed himself for missing the chance to learn something about his parents and his past. However, his worries were soon interrupted. One afternoon, during their after-lunch break, there was a knock on Matteo's door. Maria was standing there. "Matteo, the headmistress has asked to see you," Maria informed him. The other boys in the room looked at Matteo in surprise. Why would the headmistress call for him? Did he do something wrong? They wondered aloud. "Are you kidding? He's such a goody-goody," one boy scoffed. "Maybe she just wants to hear him play," another joked, and the others joined in with laughter. "Don't forget your instrument, violinist," they all shouted. Matteo quietly stood up and headed for the door. "Ignore them," Maria advised, and Matteo nodded. Yet he was now just as concerned as they were. Why had the headmistress called for him? When Matteo entered her office, he noticed that she wasn't alone. She had a visitor. When Matteo saw who it was, his heart skipped a beat. It was the same man from the train station. Mateo was stunned, unsure of what to think or do. "Please have a seat, Mateo," the headmistress said kindly. The boy sat down on a leather couch by the wall, his knees trembling and his heart pounding in his chest. He feared that he was about to be accused of something. Why else would the stern man from the train station be here? However, the expression on the headmistress's face showed neither threat nor anger. In fact, she was smiling, and her eyes were bright with excitement. "Mateo, I'd like you to meet Senor Vargas," the headmistress said warmly. "He's a renowned musician and a respected music teacher in the city. He wishes to adopt you." Mateo couldn't believe what he was hearing. He glanced from the headmistress to the gentleman and back again. "But what about my sister?" Mateo asked, his voice shaking. "I swore to myself that I would never leave her here alone." The headmistress smiled kindly at Mateo. "Don't worry about her. Senor Vargas has expressed his desire to adopt both of you." Mateo felt a huge weight lift from his heart. He looked once more into Senor Vargas's serious eyes. "But why us?" Mateo asked hesitantly. The man paused for a moment before responding. To Mateo, it seemed as though the gentleman was lost in some distant memory. "I was moved by how you played," the man finally said. Mateo believed him, but he had a strong sense that there was more to the story. He could feel that a mystery lay behind Senor Vargas's words. A week later, dressed in their finest clothes, Mateo and Lucia stood at the entrance of the orphanage with two small bags holding all their belongings. Right on time, at 9 a.m., a car pulled up, driven by Senor Vargas's chauffeur. He opened the back door for the siblings to get in, then easily lifted their bags into the trunk before taking his seat behind the wheel. Mateo and Lucia watched as the orphanage slowly faded from view, their hearts filled with a strange blend of joy and fear. They had no idea what awaited them. Lucia hadn't yet met Senor Vargas, but from what Mateo had told her, she understood that he wasn't particularly warm. She was worried that his home might be gloomy and uninviting. Plus, Lucia had just made a new friend, and she was sad to leave her behind. She promised herself that if Senor Vargas allowed it, she would visit Sofia. Clutching her stuffed bunny tightly, Lucia sighed softly. The journey took over 2 hours, and finally the car arrived at a tall fence. Beyond it, a 2-story mansion made of gray stone loomed among the trees, giving off a rather unwelcoming vibe. Mateo noticed Lucia shiver as she stared at it. "I don't want to get out of the car." "Maybe we should go back. At least we know what to expect there," she whispered. Mateo tried to comfort her, though he wasn't sure himself if they would find happiness at Senor Vargas's home. Hand in hand, they walked up the path to the house. As they approached, the door opened and a housekeeper greeted them. She led them into the living room, where Mateo noticed a grand piano standing prominently. Just like in my dream, he thought. However, the piano wasn't white, it was black. The children gazed around the luxurious home in awe, having never seen such splendor before. Meanwhile, the housekeeper showed them to their rooms. Mateo was given a large room with a view of the garden, while Lucia's room was smaller, overlooking the forest and distant mountains. Both rooms were bright and inviting. "The driver will bring your things soon," said the housekeeper. "Unpack them and then come down to the kitchen. I'll prepare something for you to eat." The children nodded in agreement. "By the way, my name is Senor Carmona. I'll be looking after you while Senor Vargas is away. Feel free to come to me with any questions." The kids nodded once more silently. Mateo's mind was buzzing with 1,000 questions, but he didn't dare to voice them. After putting away his few belongings and placing his violin case on the table by the wall, Mateo headed downstairs. Lucia hadn't arrived yet. She was always slow and took her time. However, there was already another girl seated in the kitchen. She appeared to be around Mateo's age, maybe slightly younger. She had chestnut-colored hair with streaks and bangs, and striking gray eyes. Just like Senor Vargas's, thought Mateo. Senor Carmona was setting the table. Noticing Mateo, she said, "Children, meet each other. This is Valeria, Senor Vargas's biological daughter. And this is Mateo, his adopted son. So, we're brother and sister now?" Mateo asked in amazement. Valeria simply nodded in response, cautiously watching him from beneath her bangs. unsure if she could trust him. It seemed that Valeria was still grappling with the sudden changes, suddenly having a brother and sister. But when Lucia entered the room, Valeria's expression softened slightly, and a faint smile crossed her face. Lucia looked at Valeria with wide, hopeful eyes, eager to make a new friend in the unfamiliar house. However, Valeria remained silent, and Lucia was too shy to speak first. No one broke the silence as they ate. Matteo found himself thinking that Signor Carmona's cooking was far better than anything they had at the orphanage, and this thought brought him great happiness. Even Lucia finished everything on her plate, which was a rare occurrence for her. But Valeria seemed unable to eat. She merely pushed her food around with her fork before leaving the table. Signor Carmona sighed quietly as she watched Valeria leave. "She's always like that. Don't worry about it," she said softly after Valeria had gone. "She doesn't speak much and rarely eats. Her mother passed away when she was just 5. With that, Signor Carmona tossed Valeria's uneaten food into the trash. Matteo was surprised by this. Lucia was about to ask something about their new sister when suddenly the sound of music filled the house. Someone was playing the piano. "Who's playing?" Matteo asked, entranced. The melody was beautiful, and he recognized it. It was a piece he had played on the violin himself. "Of course it's Valeria. She's been playing the piano since she was 4 years old," said Signor Carmona. "She's already quite the virtuoso." "It's really beautiful," Matteo whispered, and Lucia agreed. The children left the kitchen and quietly made their way to the living room, where Valeria was playing. She didn't notice them. Her eyes were closed as she played, which meant she was playing the piece from memory. Matteo was captivated by her talent and skill. He suddenly imagined them performing the piece together as a duet, but then he felt embarrassed by the thought. "She's the daughter of a wealthy man, and I'm just an orphan," Matteo thought sadly. Lucia and Matteo didn't disturb Valeria, and instead returned to their rooms. Later that evening, Signor Carmona knocked on Matteo's door. She told him that Signor Vargas was waiting for him in the living room. For some reason, Matteo took his violin with him as he went downstairs. Signor Vargas was seated in a chair by the window. When he saw Matteo, he gestured for him to sit in the chair beside him. Matteo sat down, resting the violin on his lap. "Tell me, do you remember anything about your childhood?" Signor Vargas asked. Matteo simply shook his head. "Nothing before I ended up in the orphanage. And you don't recall the person who taught you to play the violin?" Signor Vargas inquired. Matteo nodded, meeting the man's gaze with clear eyes, hoping that he would reveal something about his past. But instead, Signor Vargas just frowned. "I only remember a large house with paintings," the boy ventured to say, "and a white grand piano." Signor Vargas flinched, a gasp escaping his lips. Matteo leaned forward, watching his reaction closely. Could it be that this wasn't just his imagination? Could such a house truly exist? But Signor Vargas quickly regained his composure. "Play that melody from the station for me," he requested calmly. Matteo sighed and obediently took his violin from its case, beginning to play. He didn't notice when Valeria entered the room, quietly watching him from under her bangs, her thoughts unreadable. When Matteo finished playing, Signor Vargas spoke. "Valeria, come closer. Have you met your new brother?" The girl approached and nodded silently. "I want you to start practicing together so you can perform in the talent contest this spring. I believe you have a good chance of winning." Matteo's wish came true. He and Valeria began rehearsing together every day under Signor Vargas's guidance. Signor Vargas would typically listen in silence, occasionally offering comments, but overall, he was pleased with how their duet sounded. As soon as rehearsals ended, Valeria would quietly retreat to her room or the garden, and Matteo never managed to exchange more than a few words with her. Sometimes, he wondered if the girl was mute, although he had heard her soft voice when she responded to Signor Carmona on a few occasions. Lucia found life at Signor Vargas's house quite dull. She longed for a friend and constantly asked Matteo if he had made friends with Valeria yet, but he would shake his head each time. One day, while walking in the garden, Matteo spotted Valeria sitting by a small pond, feeding the plump koi fish. Matteo approached her. "Hello," he said. The girl flinched in surprise, thinking she was alone. Glancing at Matteo from beneath her bangs, Valeria nodded silently in acknowledgement. "Do you feed them every day?" Matteo asked, and she nodded again. "They're so cute," Matteo continued, squatting down beside her. "This one's my favorite," Valeria said unexpectedly, pointing to the fattest koi. "His name is Senor Amado." "Hello, Senor Amado," he said playfully. Valeria looked at him, and a faint smile crossed her face. "Do the others have names too?" Matteo inquired. Valeria named each fish in turn. "Wow! How do you keep them all straight?" Matteo asked in amazement, but Valeria just shrugged in response. They sat by the pond for a long while. Eventually, Matteo suggested playing a game. Valeria agreed. They played rock, paper, scissors, word games, and even hide-and-seek. Matteo knew Lucia would love to join them, but he realized that this might scare Valeria off. He decided it was best to wait until Valeria trusted him more before introducing her to his younger sister, and so they became friends. The next day, they played together again, having so much fun that Senor Carmona had trouble calling them in for lunch. Time passed, and the children gradually adapted to their new life in Senor Vargas's house. They spent their days playing in the garden or inside the house when it rained, enjoying the delicious meals prepared by Senor Carmona. In the evenings, Matteo and Valeria continued their rehearsals under Senor Vargas's watchful eye. When the day of the competition finally arrived, the children were filled with nervous anticipation as the driver took them into the city. Matteo could feel his legs trembling, and Valeria's heart was racing so loudly that he could almost hear it. When they reached the city center, they arrived at an elegant building where a crowd had already gathered. Senor Vargas didn't force his way through, but instead guided the children to the artist's entrance. They walked through a series of long hallways before ascending a staircase that led to a small lobby. A few other kids, dressed in their best, were already there, waiting for the contest to begin. Matteo noticed some of them were holding violin cases, just like his. He gripped his case so tightly that his knuckles turned white. Senor Vargas pointed Matteo towards the boys' dressing room and took Valeria to the adjacent one. Inside the dressing room, Matteo glanced at his reflection. Everything appeared to be in order. His hair was neatly combed, his white shirt fit perfectly, and the bow tie was straight. Taking a deep breath, he left the room, but Valeria hadn't arrived yet. When she finally appeared, Matteo was struck by her appearance. She wore a stunning white dress with silver accents that shimmered in the sunlight, and a shiny star-shaped clip adorned her hair. "You look beautiful," Matteo whispered, enchanted by her appearance, causing both of them to blush. The competition began, and one by one, the children were called to the stage, while the rest waited in the hall. The room buzzed with excitement, everyone sharing their thoughts and nerves, but Matteo and Valeria remained silent. Matteo could see that Valeria was nearly trembling with anxiety, so he stepped closer and gently took her hand. She looked at him gratefully, but remained silent. They stood like that, hand in hand, until it was their turn to perform. Matteo led Valeria towards the exit, where the bright stage lights greeted them. To his surprise, his own nerves had calmed. He recalled playing for large crowds at the train station and felt a surge of confidence. Guiding Valeria to the white grand piano in the center of the stage, Matteo took his position slightly in front. As he began to play, Valeria soon joined in, and the music filled the hall, transporting the audience into a magical world. Matteo became completely absorbed in the music, losing all awareness of his surroundings as he played. Suddenly, something felt off, and he snapped out of his reverie. It took him a moment to realize what had happened, and though he continued playing, the once smooth and harmonious melody now faltered. A disappointed murmur rippled through the audience, as if they had been jolted out of a pleasant dream. It wasn't until a moment later that Matteo realized Valeria had hit 2 wrong notes, disrupting the melody. He wanted to turn and see what had caused the mistake, as Valeria had never erred before. However, he kept playing, finishing the piece with a deep bow. The applause was polite, but lacked the enthusiastic ovation Matteo had hoped for. Sighing, he turned to Valeria, who was still sitting at the piano with her head bowed. Matteo approached her and gently took her hand. She looked up at him with tears in her eyes. "It's okay, Valeria," Matteo whispered. "You did your best." Valeria nodded weakly and stood up, her once beautiful dress now hanging limply. "Can we go to the car, please?" she asked quietly as they returned to the waiting area. "Don't you want to wait for the results?" Matteo asked, but Valeria simply shook her head. Matteo took her hand again, and they walked towards the exit where Senor Vargas was waiting for them in the car. As they approached, Matteo noticed the tension in Valeria's posture, as if she was bracing herself for her father's reaction. "What happened, Valeria?" Senor Vargas asked sharply as soon as they were in the car. Valeria remained silent, so Matteo spoke up. "It was just a small mistake. It happens to everyone." "It shouldn't have happened to my daughter," Senor Vargas replied sternly. "Did we practice every evening for nothing?" But it wasn't Valeria's fault. Matteo tried to defend her again, but Senor Vargas cut him off. "I didn't ask for your opinion." Throughout the exchange, Valeria sat quietly, shrinking into her seat and staring at the floor. When they finally arrived home, Valeria rushed to her room without a word. From that moment on, something shifted in the household. Senor Vargas began focusing solely on Matteo during their practice sessions, seemingly ignoring his own daughter. At dinner, he spoke only to Matteo and Lucia, as if Valeria wasn't there. Valeria grew even more withdrawn, rarely leaving her room. Matteo was deeply concerned about his friend, but felt powerless to help. She no longer showed interest in their old games, and Matteo felt the distance growing between them. Early one morning, Matteo was jolted awake by frantic shouting. He rushed out of his room to find Senora Teresa in a panic, yelling, "Valeria is gone!" Matteo ran to Valeria's room, where Senora Teresa stood pointing at the neatly made bed. Senor Vargas was there too, staring silently at the empty bedspread. Without hesitation, Matteo sprinted to the garden, his instincts telling him that Valeria might be there. He ran as fast as he could towards the pond, where they had first become friends. Before he even reached the pond, he heard a faint splash and pushed himself to run faster. Just as he arrived, he caught a glimpse of chestnut hair and pale hands sinking below the water's surface. Without a second thought, Matteo jumped into the water, not caring whether he could swim or not. He dived under and saw Valeria beneath the surface. Wrapping his arms around her waist, he struggled to bring her to the surface. By the time he emerged, adults were already rushing to help. They pulled both children out and gently laid a coughing Valeria on the grass. Senor Vargas leaned over his daughter, a tear rolling down his cheek. "Everything will be all right now," Senora Teresa reassured, clutching her chest as if she had been underwater herself. Lucia stood nearby, quietly crying. Thankfully, Valeria recovered quickly from the ordeal. By the next day, she was feeling much better, and her father didn't leave her side. He apologized for his harsh behavior, admitting that he had been wrong to prioritize the competition over their relationship. Valeria was calm and even smiled, but the sadness and fear in her eyes remained. Matteo hoped that in time, Valeria would heal and things would return to normal. He wanted her to play with him and Lucia as they once did. One day, he heard the sound of a piano and knew that Valeria was finally feeling better. Music was a vital part of her life, and her return to it filled Matteo with hope. He quietly went to the living room and listened, content to simply enjoy the music that meant so much to her. Noticing Matteo's presence, Valeria smiled warmly, and life in the mansion slowly began to return to its normal rhythm. Despite this, Matteo couldn't shake the curiosity about his and Lucia's past. One evening, when Senor Vargas was reading in the living room, Matteo mustered up the courage to approach him. "Did you need something, Matteo?" his adoptive father inquired, lifting his eyes from the pages of his book. Matteo hesitated momentarily, but then spoke up. "I want to learn more about my past. I think you know something about it," he said, his words coming out in a rush. Senor Vargas removed his reading glasses and sighed deeply. "Yes, I do know something," he admitted thoughtfully, "but I'm not sure if you're ready to hear it." Matteo sat down beside his adoptive father, his voice filled with determination as he said, "I'm ready. I need to know the truth about myself and Lucia. Please tell me." With a nod, Senator Vargas set aside his book and glasses, focusing on Mateo. "Very well. I'll tell you what I know. Your mother was once my student," he began. "Really?" Mateo was taken aback, hardly able to believe his ears. Senator Vargas nodded, his eyes growing distant as he delved into his memories. "I was around 30 years old at the time, and I'd been teaching music for several years. When I first met your mother, Natalia, I was immediately captivated by her. She was incredibly graceful, and every man who saw her was entranced. She had long red hair and the same blue eyes you have. But I never confessed my feelings to Natalia. It wouldn't have been appropriate. She was learning to play the violin, and she was exceptionally talented. Within a year, she was composing her own pieces. They were nothing short of magical. Every day, I found myself falling more in love with her, and she was aware of my feelings. We attended concerts and dined at restaurants together. We even traveled together, but she always maintained a certain distance. To her, I was just a teacher and a pleasant companion, nothing more." He paused before continuing. "Then she met your father. He was a wealthy patron with a deep love for music and art. He lived in the grand, bright house you've mentioned." "So that house is real?" "It wasn't just a dream," Mateo asked quietly. "It's real," Senator Vargas confirmed. "And you remembered it, even as a young child," he added before continuing. "It was painful for me to see your father lovingly holding Natalia, and to watch her lean in to whisper something in his ear. But there was nothing I could do. Their love for each other was undeniable, and I didn't want to stand in the way of their happiness. I remained a beloved teacher and a close friend to Natalia. Eventually, I met Valeria's mother, and we got married. A year later, your parents also married, and soon after, you were born. When you were 3 or 4, Natalia began teaching you the violin. It was challenging for you, but your mother's patience paid off. Then Lucia was born, and Natalia's happiness seemed complete. Everything was perfect. At this point, Senator Vargas sighed heavily, and Mateo sensed that something tragic was about to be revealed. "What happened to my parents? Where are they now?" Mateo asked, his voice tinged with dread. They're gone," his adoptive father responded quietly. "There was a car accident. Their bodies were found in the wreckage, but you and Lucia somehow survived. It seems you both managed to get out of the car and went searching for help, realizing that your parents weren't moving." Mateo was stunned by the revelation. His mind raced, unable to fully process the news that his parents were no longer alive. The same devastating thought echoed in his mind. They were gone. "The trauma of the accident likely caused you to forget everything," Senator Vargas concluded, noticing a tear rolling down Mateo's cheek. He reached out and took Mateo's hand. "I'm so sorry," he said gently. Mateo could only sob in response. "They were wonderful people," Senator Vargas continued, his voice filled with emotion. "I would give anything to bring them back. When I learned that Natalia was gone, it felt like a part of me died with her." After a brief pause, Senator Vargas added, "When I heard you were missing, and with no relatives left to care for you, I feared the worst. But then one day at the train station, I heard a familiar melody. I would recognize it anywhere. It was your mother's favorite composition, one she wrote when she first fell in love with your father. I rushed to find the source of the music and realized it was you playing. At first, I didn't recognize you. It had been years, and you had changed. For a moment, I thought you had somehow stolen my student's melody. But then I connected the dots and realized you were her son. That's when I decided to take you in. I'm sorry I didn't tell you the truth earlier. I was afraid of reopening old wounds, and you had already been through so much." Mateo nodded, understanding the weight of his adoptive father's decision. "Everything happens in its own time," he replied, his voice carrying a maturity beyond his years. From that day forward, Mateo often thought about his parents before falling asleep, trying to picture them in his mind. Eventually, he asked Senator Vargas if he had a photograph of them. His adoptive father promised to look for one. Later that evening, Senator Vargas handed Mateo a small photograph. It showed a beautiful young woman in a red evening dress, standing beside a handsome young man with curly hair, who bore a striking resemblance to Matteo. Matteo carefully placed the photo in his notebook, silently vowing to show it to Lucia when she was older. After this conversation, the atmosphere in Senor Vargas's mansion seemed to change. The house felt warmer, more like a true home. The family began spending their evenings together, talking, sharing news, playing board games, solving crosswords, or reading books aloud. But most often, Matteo and Valeria would perform impromptu concerts, with Senor Vargas, Lucia, and Teresa as their most devoted audience. Senor Vargas frequently told Matteo and Valeria that they needed to attend a music academy because of their natural talent. The children eagerly anticipated this, filled with hope and excitement. When they turned 16, Matteo and Valeria left to study at the academy. Although everyone assumed they were siblings, their bond grew into something deeper. Matteo continued to look after Valeria, protecting her from life's challenges, while Valeria supported him in subjects he found difficult. Matteo's passion for music only grew stronger. Upon graduation, both were offered positions in the academy's orchestra, making them the youngest members. Around this time, Matteo proposed to Valeria, and they soon married. Valeria was the most beautiful bride, her eyes sparkling like diamonds, and Matteo couldn't have been happier. They lived in harmony, touring together, and never growing tired of each other's company. 2 years into their marriage, Valeria discovered she was expecting a child. They had a son, whom they named Matteo after his father. The baby resembled his grandfather, with long, slender fingers that hinted at a future in music. Dear viewers, if you enjoyed this story, please support the video by liking it and leaving a comment. Thank you so much.